Hi, my name is Lars Friis, and today I'm going to show you step by step how to set up a cookie banner and Google Consent Mode version 2 on a WordPress site. We will be using Google Tag Manager for the implementation, and our cookie banner today is going to be from cookieinformation.com. I recommend cookieinformation.com because it's easy to set up and because they are a certified Google CMP partner, so you can be sure that you follow all the requirements by Google and you are compliant with GDPR. The first step is to create a cookie banner. Then we're going to install Google Tag Manager on our WordPress site. And lastly, we're going to set up consent mode and configure all our tags to support Google Consent Mode. First step is to create a free trial. So let's go ahead and click Get a Free Trial. You fill in the form with your company name, email, phone number, and you will receive an email where you can confirm your account and with a link to the cookie information backend. Here's the cookie information backend, and you can go ahead and click Create Consent Solution. Here we type in the URL of the site. Mine will be wordpress.larsfries.io. And it's a public domain, and the scanner settings in my case would just be the standard with weekly frequency. If you have a site that changes on a daily basis with new content or new tools, I recommend you select daily scans, but most sites would be fine with weekly. Depth depends on your subpages. And in my case, it's just a small test site, so we will go with light. Languages you can select a lot of different standard language. My case would be English. But if you have a site with multiple languages, then you can add additional languages down here. So maybe we should have Icelandic or an Italian. Then these will also be available in your solution. And we can press Create. Once we've set up the domain, we can change the appearance of our banner. And we select Pop-up Appearance. And in here you can choose between different templates. I recommend the standard template called Overlay version 2, Google Consent Mode version 2. And this is a overlay banner where the user is forced to either accept or decline before they can access the site. This gives the highest consent rate, and it's also easier for you to implement the different consent triggers when you are sure that consent has been defined before the user can interact with the site. So just keep the default banner. And if you want to do some custom, you can expand the advanced. And in here under CSS, you can change the colors of the different elements. And if you would like to add your logo to the banner, you can scroll down in JavaScript and you can find as a logo function here. And if you in here add a path to your logo, then there will be a company logo on the cookie banner as well. So this is the design. We'll just keep the standard in our case. If you would like to change the copy and translations of your banner, you can select copy and translation and the language you would like to modify. And we have the English selected now. And in here you can change the different text in your banner, and you can also change the text on the accept and decline buttons and so on. And there's also possibility to change the policy and privacy and different categories. But we'll just keep this standard. And then we have the general settings. It's the same as we typed in the first step, but here is the consent name. And the only thing that you need to change in here is first-party cookie blocking. And this is a feature from cookie information that if it's turned on, it would automatically delete all the cookies on the site if the user declines cookies. but we would like to have the control over our cookies in Google Tag Manager, so we are able to manually define what consent the different tools require. So please disable this and click Save. And that's it. So now we have configured our cookie banner and we are ready to install Tag Manager on our WordPress site. We need to create an account. If you already have an account, like this case, you can click the three dots and select Create a Container. If you don't have an account, you can select Create Account. And by the way, the URL is just tagmanager.google.com. We will create a new container and we'll call it WordPress.larsfries.io, and it's a web container. And then you can click Create. And we have a Google Tag Manager container. You need to copy the ID of the container so we can install it on the WordPress site. So you can just copy the GTM ID here and click OK. You can also see the ID up here if you want. So now it's copied and we can go into WordPress. And there is a really nice plugin you can use. It's called GTM for WordPress. It's the most used plugin and it has very positive reviews. So I have just installed the plugin and activated it. And then we can go into settings here. And we just need to paste our GTM ID and click Save. Sometimes when you click Save, this toggle will be set to off, container code on off, and if this happens you just need to reselect on and click Save. So now we have Google Tag Manager on our WordPress site. Next step is to install the cookie banner and Google Consent Mode. And as you will see, this is really simple. So we can just go into Templates and into the gallery and search for cookie information. Cookie information, consent mode version 2. This is the tag we will be using. So now I just added it and we can go into tags and click new. And we can select cookie information consent mode version 2. I would like to add a banner. So I select add cookie information consent banner. And now we can select the language. In my case, I will just be using default language for English. So I can keep this settings and here select English. But you can also use a GTM variable, or you can use this to set up different domains and the language that should be used on the specific domains. But we will keep the default, and yeah, so now the banner is actually going to be implemented. The next setting is a default consent setting, and we need to have, in order to be compliant with Google Consent Mode and Google Ads, we need to have a default as denied. So maybe I was too fast, but you can click add row and everything should be denied. And in here you can select specific regions if you only want it on specific regions. Our case would just be that this applies to all regions, so we can just leave it blank and click add. So now all users will have a default consent with denied. The last two settings is redact ads data, and this is a normally in Google Consent Mode. If the user declines cookies or ad storage, there will be no cookies for Google Ads, and it will not send any data to Google Ads unless it's anonymized data. If you select this, it's a double sort of security measurement. So it will, if the user declines cookies, it will send any anonymous request through a cookieless domain, and it would also strip any click identifiers from the URLs. So this is a double security measurement that I recommend you to enable, and it only affects the users that declines cookies. Pass-through URL parameters should be enabled if you have a non-overlay banner. So if you have a banner where the user can interact and go to page 2 or page 3 before making their consent decision, then this should be enabled. But since we have an overlay banner, you should not enable this. Wait for update is a setting where you can define how long time the visitors should have to make a decision on their consent. I recommend to set this to 15,000, so the user will have 15 seconds to make a decision for either accepting or declining cookies on your site. And this means that when a user opens your site and they don't interact with the banner, then after 15 seconds we will assume that that user declined cookies, and we will have a sort of anonymous ping to the Google servers. But if you set this too low, there is, for instance, the default 500, then if the user does not accept before 500 milliseconds, then all tags will assume that cookies has been declined. So this is quite important that you update this. So that's all the settings. Now we just need to add a trigger, and we can use the default consent initialization, and we can press save. And I'll just keep the original name. Yeah. So now we have a cookie banner and we have Google Consent Mode. If we go and preview, we should be able to see the banner. I have added the URL for my site. And as you can see, we have a cookie information banner where we can decline and accept cookies. In Tag Assistant, we can confirm if consent mode is working. So if we go into the consent tab here, we can see the consent status, and you can see right here in the initial load there's no consent, but after we fire the cookie information banner, we have the default consent event here, and everything is denied. And if you expand this, you can also see that the wait for update is correctly set to 15,000. So default consent is working as intended. And if we go ahead and accept, we can see now that we get a consent update and everything is granted. So we can confirm that we have a working cookie banner and consent mode version 2 is working. And by the way, the features that difference consent mode version 2 and consent mode version 1 is the consent called add user data and add personalization. If these were not present, it would be consent mode version 1, but we have consent version 2 here. Next step is to set up your tags. And I'm going to show you an example of a tag with built-in consent mode. That's all Google tags. And afterwards, we're going to have a tag without built-in consent mode. So let's just set up a standard GA4 tag. So I'm going into tags and new, and I will select a Google Analytics tag here. In order to set up Google Analytics, I recommend you to have a config tag and then afterwards have tags for each specific event. So let's just set up a config tag. I'll just add a random ID here. And in my configuration, I would like page view not to be fired. I would like to do that manually. So I'll just put this to false. And the trigger would be initialization. And we can call this GA4 config. So it's just a simple config tag, so GA4 would be ready when we will be sending any data or any events. So we can click save. And now I will add a page view. So we go into new and we go into Google Analytics and GA4 event, and just put in my random measurement ID, and the event name would be page view. And next, we need to set up a trigger. But first, I would like to show you how you can see that it has built-in consent. So if you go into advanced and you scroll down to consent settings, down here you can see the different consents, and you can also see that it has built-in consent checks here for ad storage, personalization, user data, and analytics storage. So this has built-in consent, so we don't need to do any manual settings. You will see that later when we have a tag without built-in consent. My trigger for page view will just be page view, so we can select all pages, and we can call this GA4 page view. Click save. Let's try to preview. So I go into preview, and let's just look at the different events. So you can see here that in here we have cookie information, where we fire the banner and default consent. And up here we fire the GA4 config tag, and on container loaded we fire the page view. Please note that it might appear like we have, because if we look at the site now, we did not accept or decline any cookies. So it might appear like we have been firing Google tags without consent. But since it has built-in consent and we are using wait for update, you can see here in consent that when the tags fire, consent is denied, and we had the wait for update for 15 seconds. So right now these tags, the GA4 page view and the GA4 config, these tags are waiting for consent update or waiting for the wait for update for 15 seconds to take into effect. So no data is sent and no cookies are set. But if I go in and accept all, we have an consent update with granted, and then all the Google tags that we're waiting for consent will be fired with granted. If I denied, the same tags would be fired with denied. So we would have anonymous hit to the Google server, but now we have a hit with data because the user has accepted. So Google tags are very, very easy to set up. You can just use the normal page view triggers or whatever trigger you have. You just need to make sure that you don't fire the event before the default consent has been set. If any of your tags fire before default consent, it will be sending data without consent. And you'll also get an alarm in here where you can see that a tag has, if you open the consent tab here, you will have an alarm down here where you can see that tag had fired before consent was defined. But yeah, so this is how to set up the Google tags, and we can confirm that everything is working correctly. Next, I would like to show you how to set up a tag without built-in consent. And I will be using LinkedIn as an example, where we can see how to set up consent. So let's go into tags and click new. And I just imported the LinkedIn tag. And if we go into advanced and consent settings, you will notice that there is no default consent. So there's no built-in consent here as we saw with the Google tag before. So we need to set up manually that we require consent. And in my case, since it's marketing, I will require ad storage, but you can also select other storage types. So we'll be using or requiring ad storage, and we can just call it LinkedIn page view. And first I would like to show you what happens if we just fire this on page view. Because in our case now, we will see that it has been trying to fire on page view, but before consent was defined. So let's just save this and I'll just show you what happens. So you can see here on container loaded, we tried to fire LinkedIn, but it was blocked. And if I accept now, consent is updated to granted, but LinkedIn tag is still not fired. You can see here LinkedIn page view did not fire, and that is because we evaluated consent before consent was updated. So we evaluated consent here on container loaded, LinkedIn page view, and here consent was denied. And because it didn't have built-in consent, it wasn't sent on the update. So we need to change the trigger into an event where we know consent has been updated. And for cookie information, you can use the event called cookie_cat_necessary, because this event always fires when consent has been defined, so either granted or accepted. So instead of using page view, we will be using cookie_cat_necessary as our trigger. So if we go back to our LinkedIn page view, and I'll just go in and change the trigger and make a new one up here. And this would be a custom event called cookie_cat_necessary. And I can click save and save again. Let's preview this. And we have the cookie banner here. And you can see now that we did not fire LinkedIn yet. But if I accept now, on cookie_cat_necessary, LinkedIn has fired because consent is granted. So please make sure that when you're using tags without built-in consent, that you evaluate or trigger the event when consent has been updated. And for all page view events, you can just use cookie_cat_necessary. But if you have another event that occurs related to the page view, we will need to set up a custom trigger. And I would like to show you an example of a purchase. So let's just make a new tag called, I'll copy this and I'll call it LinkedIn purchase. And let's just use a trigger called purchase. I have a test purchase site to use. So we have a trigger called purchase. And again, we require add storage. And if we preview this, we will be using the purchase page. You can see here we have purchase and we have also different data layers. And in my case, you can see here that we on purchase try to trigger LinkedIn, but it has been blocked. And if I accept now, LinkedIn purchase is still going to be blocked because the consent is giving after the evaluation. So in order to make sure that purchase fires, we need to make a trigger group where we combine purchase with cookie_cat_necessary, because then we know both event has occurred and consent is ready. So if we go back and we select LinkedIn purchase again, I would like to create a trigger group in triggers and new. Scroll down to trigger group. We can select purchase and cookie_cat_necessary. So I'll call it purchase plus consent. So this event will require both events to happen on the same page. We can click save. And if we preview again, we should see that purchase is now firing correctly. You can see here is the trigger group, and we can see we are firing LinkedIn purchase because consent is now granted. And let's just see if we decline. I'll just reload the page. And I decline cookies. You can see here that we still have the same trigger group, but LinkedIn is now blocked because consent is denied. So that's how to set up non-Google tags without built-in consent mode. So it's a little bit more complicated, but as long as you make sure that you don't fire before consent is given or is defined, then you should have no problems. Last thing we need to do is to confirm that all tags has consent configured. And you can do that by going into admin and container settings and enable consent overview and click save. If you go back to your workspace under tags, you can see this new shield. If you click this, you have an overview of the consents that has been configured down here, and you can also see the consent here that has not been configured. So we need to make sure that all tags is configured, and in this case you can see that we have built-in consent for all these Google tags. So we can just select these and click the shield, and we can say no additional consent required because they have built-in consent. Oh, I forgot this. It's the same. Yeah. So now we can confirm that all tags has consent configured. You can see LinkedIn here has ad storage as we defined before, and the other tags has the built-in consent. So all tags have consent now, and we are using consent mode version 2.